Picture yourself stepping outside on a crisp March morning in 1888, the kind of day that promised spring was finally arriving. The air carried that familiar hint of warmth, snow melting into muddy puddles, children running without heavy coats for the first time in months. New York City bustled with life, horse-drawn carriages clattering down cobblestone streets, merchants setting up their stalls, workers heading to factories and offices. Nobody carried umbrellas. Nobody wore their heaviest winter gear. Why would they? The weather had been mild, almost pleasant, and the newspapers predicted more of the same. This was March 12th, 1888, and by nightfall, this ordinary Monday would become the most deadly winter storm in American history. The blizzard that buried the entire eastern seaboard under mountains of snow and claimed over 400 lives in just 3 days. If you lived through it, you survived something that changed the way America thought about weather forever. The morning started like any other. Temperatures hovered around 30 degrees, nothing unusual for early spring in the Northeast. Businessmen walked briskly to their offices in light overcoats. Women stepped out in their regular dresses, perhaps carrying a light shawl. Children played in the streets, splashing through puddles left by the recent thaw. The Weather Bureau, still a relatively new government agency, had issued their forecast the night before. Fair weather, they said. Light winds, mild temperatures, perhaps a few scattered clouds. Nothing to worry about. Nobody questioned it. Weather prediction was still primitive, relying on basic barometric readings and telegraph reports from distant stations. Meteorologists had no satellites, no radar, no computer models. They made educated guesses based on limited information, and on March 12th, 1888, they guessed wrong. By noon, something felt different. The air grew still, unnaturally quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Experienced sailors and farmers, those who lived their lives reading the sky, felt it first. A pressure change, subtle but unmistakable. The kind of stillness that comes before nature unleashes its fury. But most people were indoors working, completely unaware that two massive weather systems were converging directly overhead. A warm, moist air mass pushing up from the south was about to collide with an Arctic blast racing down from Canada. The collision would create a storm of unprecedented power, but nobody saw it coming. The first flakes began falling around 2 in the afternoon. Gentle at first, the kind of light snow that melts the moment it touches the ground. Office workers glanced out windows and shrugged. A spring snow shower, nothing more. It would pass. But the flakes grew larger, fell faster, and within an hour, the gentle shower had become a steady snowfall. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 30 minutes. Winds picked up, whistling through the city streets, turning the falling snow into horizontal sheets of white. Still, most people weren't worried. They'd seen spring storms before. This would blow over by evening. By 4 o'clock, the storm had revealed its true nature. Snow fell so hard you couldn't see across the street. The wind howled like a living thing, driving the snow into towering drifts that blocked doorways and buried carriages. The temperature plummeted to 10 below zero, turning the wet streets into sheets of ice. People who had left home that morning in light clothing found themselves trapped in offices, stores, and factories, watching through frosted windows as their city disappeared under a blanket of white. The horse-drawn omnibuses, the lifeline of urban transportation, ground to a halt. Horses struggled through snow that reached their bellies, then gave up entirely as the drifts grew higher than their heads. The elevated railway systems, the pride of New York's modern transportation network, became death traps. Trains loaded with evening commuters found themselves stranded on elevated tracks 30 feet above the snow-covered streets. The third rail, which powered the electric trains, began sparking and failing as snow and ice accumulated. Passengers sat in unheated cars watching the storm rage around them, realizing they were trapped with no way down. Some trains lost power completely, leaving hundreds of people suspended above the city in the dark, with no heat, no food, and no idea when rescue might come. The telegraph lines snapped under the weight of ice and the force of 60-mile-per-hour winds. The city's communication with the outside world went dead. Telephone service, still a luxury for most families, failed completely. The storm had cut New York off from the rest of the country, turning America's largest city into an isolated island in a sea of white. Nobody knew how bad it was elsewhere. Nobody could call for help. Fire departments couldn't respond to emergencies. Police couldn't patrol the streets. Hospitals couldn't reach patients. The storm had paralysed everything that made the city function. As darkness fell on March 12th, the full horror of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a snowstorm. This was a natural disaster of unimaginable proportions. The wind reached hurricane force, driving snow so hard it felt like being sandblasted with ice. Drifts piled 20, 30, even 50 feet high in some areas, burying entire buildings. People who had ventured outside became lost within blocks of their homes, wandering in circles through a white wilderness that had swallowed familiar landmarks. Some froze to death just yards from safety, unable to find shelter in the blinding chaos. The city's hospitals became fortresses of horror. Doctors and nurses who had arrived for their shifts found themselves trapped with patients as the storm raged outside. Emergency cases piled up, but ambulances couldn't move through the streets. Women in labour couldn't reach maternity wards. People suffering heart attacks died in their homes because help couldn't get through. Dr. William Morrison at Bellevue Hospital later wrote about watching through the windows as people collapsed in the snow just outside the building, so close he could see them. But the drifts were too deep for rescue teams to reach them. The hospital's morgue filled beyond capacity as bodies were brought in by anyone brave enough to venture into the storm. The poor suffered the worst. Wealthy families had coal stored in their cellars, thick walls and servants to tend fires through the night. But in the tenements of the Lower East Side, families huddled together in single rooms, burning furniture to stay warm as their coal supplies ran out. Children who had played in puddles that morning now pressed against frozen windows, watching their breath form clouds in rooms that felt like ice boxes. Some families broke up wooden floors and staircases for fuel. Others wrapped themselves in every piece of clothing they owned and waited for dawn, praying they'd live to see it. The storm turned ordinary people into heroes and cowards in equal measure. James Marshall, a postal worker, died trying to deliver mail through the blizzard because he believed the mail must go through. His body was found 3 blocks from the post office, still clutching his mail bag. Meanwhile, Samuel White, a hotel owner, charged stranded travellers 10 times the normal rate for rooms, knowing they had no choice but to pay or freeze to death on the street. The storm stripped away social pretenses, revealing who people really were when survival was at stake. Train stations became refugee camps. Grand Central Depot, normally a symbol of progress and efficiency, filled with hundreds of stranded passengers. They slept on benches, on floors, anywhere they could find space. Food ran out by midnight. The station's restaurants had never planned to feed an entire city of trapped travellers. People shared whatever they had, strangers breaking bread together, mothers nursing other women's babies when their own milk dried up from stress and cold. The wealthy sat beside labourers, all equal in their helplessness against the storm's fury. Outside the cities, the situation was even more desperate. Farmers who had gone out to tend their animals never made it back to the house. Entire families were found frozen together, having died trying to reach their barn just 50 yards away. The snow fell so fast and the wind blew so hard that people lost all sense of direction. They would walk in circles, thinking they were heading home, only to collapse from exhaustion in fields they'd worked their entire lives. Rural communities were completely cut off. Some weren't found for weeks after the storm passed. The elevated trains told their own story of horror. Passengers trapped 30 feet above the streets watched as the storm buried the city below them. In one car, a woman gave birth during the height of the blizzard, with only strangers to help her. The baby survived, born into a world of howling wind and ice. In another train, an elderly man died of a heart attack, and his body had to remain with the other passengers for 2 days because there was no way to remove it. People rationed their food, shared their coats, and told stories to keep their spirits up as the hours dragged by. The wind created sounds nobody had ever heard before. It shrieked through the city like 1,000 banshees, rattling windows, tearing off roofs, sending debris flying through the air like missiles. People described it as the sound of the world ending. The snow didn't just fall, it attacked, driven by winds so fierce they could knock a grown man off his feet. The combination of wind and snow created a white wall that moved like a living thing, swallowing buildings, streets, entire neighborhoods in minutes. By dawn on March 13th, New York City looked like another planet. Buildings were buried to their second floors. Streets had disappeared entirely, replaced by rolling hills of white. The few people who managed to look outside saw a landscape that belonged in the Arctic, not in America's greatest city. Some buildings had collapsed under the weight of snow. Others stood like islands in a frozen sea, their windows dark, their inhabitants either dead or waiting for rescue that might never come. For rescue that might never come. The blizzard of 1888 lasted 3 days, but its impact lasted a lifetime. When the snow finally stopped falling and the winds died down, America had changed forever. The storm killed over 400 people, paralyzed the entire eastern seaboard, and exposed just how vulnerable modern civilization really was. But from that tragedy came transformation. Cities buried their power lines underground. Weather forecasting became a national priority. Emergency services were completely redesigned. The elevated railway systems were rebuilt with better safety measures. New York's subway system was born from the ashes of those stranded trains. The people who survived carried the memory forever. Children who lived through that March night grew up to become adults who never trusted weather forecasts, who always kept extra food stored, who understood that nature could turn deadly without warning. They told their children and grandchildren about the morning that started like spring and ended like the Arctic, about the storm that taught America to respect the power of weather. The Great Blizzard of 1888 remains the deadliest winter storm in American history, not because of the snow depth or the wind speed, but because of how completely unprepared everyone was. It was a reminder that no matter how modern we think we are, nature still has the final word. And sometimes that word can change everything in just 3 days. If you enjoyed seeing history brought back to life, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more videos like this.